next is one of my all-time favorite people in academics, whose keynote address is called Lessons Learned from the Homeless Pet Owners. We've been big fans of Dr. Irvine since the inception of the My Dog is My Home organization, and she's been incredibly gracious and engaged with us from the very start, beginning way back when we were still that exhibit. She delivered our keynote on opening night of My Dog is My Home, the exhibition in Los Angeles. We're glad to come back around full circle with Dr. Irvine, one of our heroes. Leslie is a professor of sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder and director of CU's Animals and Society Certificate Program. Her research focuses on the roles of animals in society. She is the author of several books, including My Dog Always Eats First, which examines homeless people's relationships with their companion animals. Welcome, Leslie.
Hi, Carolyn. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Greetings from Colorado. I'm going to start with a short reading from the book. I've never done this over Zoom. I've only done this in person, so let's see how it works. As I drove along a busy 4-lane street in Boulder, Colorado, one summer afternoon over a decade ago, I saw a young man and his dog standing on the median at a traffic light. By the man's age and appearance, I guessed him to be one of the countless people who camp on the National Forest land around Boulder, especially during the summer. They come into the city to panhandle for enough money to buy what supplies they need. They often have dogs with them. This particular man stood facing traffic and he held a piece of corrugated cardboard with the words, "Homeless, hungry, anything helps," scrawled on it in crude black letters written with magic marker. He had 2 well-worn, overstuffed packs with him. Lying against them was a medium-sized mixed breed dog. Each time the stoplight turned red, another round of drivers reached out their windows to hand him money. The young man trotted over to each car in turn, leaving the dog to wait for him. The narrow median didn't provide much room to maneuver. If either the dog or the man lost footing, they would fall into the traffic. All the while, the summer sun beat down relentlessly on them both. I saw a combination gas station and convenience store across from where the pair stood. I pulled my car in, parked, and bought a bottle of cold water. Then I went to the trunk of my car and took out a folding water dish that I kept there to use on hikes with my dog. I waited for a break in traffic and crossed over to the median. I stood in front of this man, but in doing so, I inadvertently blocked driver's view of his sign. Without acknowledging me, he shifted to the very edge of the median and held the sign out to the side of me. I offered him the water and the bowl for his dog. "I don't need it," he said, keeping his eyes on the cars with their potential donors. "Your dog looks thirsty," I replied. "He's okay," he said matter-of-factly. "I got plenty of water." He reached down and lifted the flap on one of his packs to reveal a gallon jug. "Okay," I said, "do you have food for him?" "Yup," he said, still no eye contact. He tapped his foot on the other bag so I could hear the crunch of dog food. "Okay," I said, and I crossed back over to my car. By this time, a woman I knew from my volunteer work at the local Humane Society had also pulled into the gas station. She was concerned about the dog too. I told her what I had done and about the man's response. She thought we could pool our money and buy the dog from him. Together, we came up with nearly $60, most of it hers. The guy should be happy to get some real money, we reasoned. After all, he was begging for change and we would offer dollars. We crossed over to the median together. My friend attempted some pleasantries and then said, "We'd like to buy your dog." Without taking his eyes off the cars, he said, "You can't have my dog. Leave me alone." I explained our logic to him. "You're begging for spare change and we can give you more than you'll make here all afternoon. Your dog will have a good home." "Get out of my face," he said. "I'm not selling my dog." We persisted. We took turns telling him how his dog deserved a better life. He might have chosen homelessness, we said, but his dog hadn't. At this point, he looked straight at us and exploded, and if there are children in the room, please cover their ears. "You fucking yuppies. Why don't you mind your own fucking business? I take good care of my dog. He has a great life. He runs around in the forest all the time. He never has to be on a leash except when he comes down here. He's got food, he's got water, he's had his shots, he never leaves my side. He's fine. Now get the hell out of here and leave me alone. We crossed back over to the gas station where we shared our outrage and our frustration. We had one last idea. We would call animal control. Cell phones hadn't yet become ubiquitous, and I used the station's payphone, remember those, to make the call. When I reached the dispatcher, I told her about the man and the dog on the median and gave the location. Is he harming the animal? She asked. No, I replied. Is the dog in distress? She asked. No, I answered again. Does the owner have food and water for him? Yes, I responded. Well, then there's nothing the officers can do. He's not doing anything wrong. I wasn't convinced. I thought he was doing something wrong. It was nothing I could put my finger on, no mistake that he could correct. Instead, the whole picture looked wrong to me. My friend thought so too. We felt sure that he couldn't provide proper care. We believed that a dog should have a better life. For us, that life meant 4 walls, a roof, and even a yard. It would have involved toys, crate training, and doggy daycare. For the young man on the median, a good life for a dog meant freedom, the outdoors, and constant companionship. Years after that incident, I got an email from a publisher, and long story short, I said I'd do a pilot project, interview some people, and see whether it could become a book. Now, before I agreed to do the research, I saw a lot of guys around Boulder like this, and women. But of course, once I said I'd do the research, they disappeared, or I only saw them when I hadn't planned to do any interviews. And this audience knows well, if you want to talk to homeless people, you can go to any shelter or soup kitchen. But this group recognizes and is trying to change the fact that most shelters don't allow animals. So you won't find homeless pet owners there. So I had to figure out a way to find people who were under the radar. Through the miracle of the internet, I got in touch with veterinarians who run street clinics for the pets of the homeless. And connecting with the veterinarians was an incredible opportunity. The technicians and the clinic volunteers introduced my project to clients during intake interviews. They listed the names of people willing to be interviewed, and I worked my way down the list. In addition, I tagged along with veterinarians on house calls, so to speak, to places I would never have gone on my own, places like this, for example. Overall, the book ended up being based on 75 interviews with people in 5 cities. Most of the people had dogs, but there were cat owners too. Some of them had multiple animals. Most had a single pet. And as you know, there are many, many, many ways of being homeless. And I'll just summarize to give you a sense of the norm among those I met. Most people lived on the street or outdoors, a few in a vehicle, and some had been homeless for over 2 years, with one man living on the street for 23 years. A number of people had bounced between housing and the street many times over their lives. A lot of the homeless youth described themselves as traveling rather than homeless, and some people preferred the term houseless to homeless. Initially, I wanted to find out how they could afford to feed their animals. I thought I'd provide dog and cat food in appreciation of their time for interviews. But I soon learned that feeding their pets was the very least of their worries, and the book ended up being titled, "My Dog Always Eats First." So I also wanted to understand what the relationship was like between homeless people and their pets. In the book, I discussed the different meanings that people assign to their relationships with their pets and how those different definitions reflect the circumstances and the experiences of homelessness. Today, I'm just going to discuss 2 of these, and then I'll conclude with 3 lessons I learned from homeless pet owners. The first theme I found involves describing the pet as friend and family member, sometimes both. For example, I met a woman I called Max who rented a room in a squat with her husband and their dog. And when I asked why they paid rent, she explained that the man who had found the house had designated himself as the landlord, and they preferred paying for an illegal squat to sleeping in Max's truck, which they had done for several weeks. Max saw no other options that would allow them to keep their dog. As she said, finding a place to sleep was the hardest thing, but if my dog's not welcome, hey, you know what I mean? I only go where my dog's welcome. I didn't bring her into the situation just to dump her off in the street. It's a lifelong commitment. We're family. So in accounting for why she let herself be exploited by an illegal landlord, Max justified her actions in terms of commitment to keeping her family together. I found that other people who were newly homeless also invested a lot of effort in trying to get off the street, and they often framed their animals as their incentive for trying to do so. For example, at one clinic, I met Isaac, an African-American man in his 20s with his dog Raja, a tan pit bull. Isaac was in treatment for an addiction to cocaine and heroin. He had stayed clean for several years, but he recently relapsed and ended up on the street. And I asked him what that was like. He said, cheerfully at first, oh, it was pretty bad. Then he shook his head and corrected himself. It was terrible, actually. But I felt a little better because I had him with me. We had a blanket, so it was okay, but it was still rough. I didn't want to stay rough like that, so that's why I came into treatment, so we could have a better life. I got tired of living the way I was living. Having him, I realized I didn't want to live like this. I didn't want to make the dog suffer. My best friend living like this, homeless. I need to get myself together. I can have a better life. That's how I looked at it. One of the other things that struck me during the research is how much time homeless people have to spend waiting and how they have to figure out how to make time pass, often in public spaces. Those who have dogs in particular find this a little bit easier. For example, I met Austin, a man in his early 30s who had lost count of how many times he had been homeless. He had stayed with friends, but wore out his welcome, and he was sleeping outdoors when we met. This meant waking up early, often being rousted by the police, and having to find ways to legitimately hang out in public. As he told me, it's lonely when you have to find somewhere to be until at 6 in the morning until like 9, 10 when things are open. And if you have a dog with you, it gives you something to do, somewhere to go. You can come out to the park here and sit out here longer than you could do if you were by yourself. If I didn't feel the way I did about him, I wouldn't have him because he's a lot of hassle sometimes, but he's family. And so he's with me all the time, and that helps. Now, describing an animal as best friend or family member is very common, but in these cases, it depicts the owner as a responsible and committed person. In studies of street life, salvaging a sense of self-worth consistently ranks as one of the most challenging and most important tasks the homeless face. The act of defining an animal as a friend or family member, words we so easily take for granted, represents a way to construct and maintain a sense that whatever circumstances you might be in, you're basically a good person. The other theme I'll discuss is when a person describes their animals having saved or changed their life. First, I'll tell you about Tommy. He was about 40 and had been homeless for 10 years when we met. In accounting for his situation, he had said he'd been a bad kid, in his words. I stole and I did drugs, he said. Fighting, stabbing, shooting, years of abuse, he told me. He'd been unable to work since he'd witnessed a fatal accident on a job site. He described himself as not mentally stable and he was living on SSI. As he told me about what his dog Monty meant to him, I found his story interesting, but mostly more of what I'd heard from other people. My dog is my best friend, he protects my camp, and so on. And I'd almost turned off the recorder and ended the interview when Tommy said, Monty also got me off alcohol and got me off drugs. Now I'm sober and I'm healthy. So I asked Tommy how Monty had done this. He said he had gotten sober during a stint in jail. After his release, he felt like he was beginning to get his life back on track, but Monty provided the motivation that he needed. He said, when I got myself out of jail, I told myself that I wouldn't drink again, I wouldn't smoke again, and I told that to Monty. And every time I want to go get a drink, he looks at me and he almost shakes his head and says, you know what you just went through the last 35 years. Now, all pet owners often create simple and lovable identities for their animals, especially for dogs. But Tommy constructed a nearly heroic identity for Monty, one that really surpassed his own in a moral sense. He gave Monty the identity of an older brother or a knowing uncle, someone wise to Tommy's ways, who knew that the past wasn't worth repeating. As a silent witness, Monty reminded Tommy to stay on the straight and narrow path by staying clean and sober. Another example, Denise had lived in her car with her cat for over 8 months when we met. She had been self-employed as a graphic artist, but severe depression caused her to miss deadlines. She lost some major clients. Her accounts gradually dwindled away. She fell behind on her rent. Landlord evicted her. She tried to find a place to live before she had to move out of her apartment. But when her time ran out, she put her belongings in storage and moved into the car with Ivy. The addiction made it hard for Denise to find another apartment, as it had for many of the people I interviewed. In addition, being middle-aged and single with no dependents made her ineligible for a lot of the housing programs around. Having Ivy made finding housing even more difficult. And when I asked if she had considered finding Ivy another home, Denise shook her head emphatically, and she said, she was a bit distant when I first adopted her, and then she grew to know me, but she's very frightened still of any new people, new situations. So I've kept her pretty protected. And that's why when I became homeless, I didn't want to give her up, even though I know I had a lot of housing opportunities if I didn't have my cat. So although Denise felt that she was protecting Ivy and doing the best thing for her, people often told her she had no right to keep a cat in her circumstances. When I asked her how she responded, she said, I have a history with depression up to suicide ideation, and I refer to Ivy as my suicide barrier. And I don't say that in a light way. I would say most days, she's the reason why I keep going, because I made a commitment to take care of her when I adopted her. So she needs me and I need her. He is the only source of daily, steady affection and companionship that I have. The only one. I can't imagine being with her at all, going on without her. Denise's story shows how the dependence of animals can draw on and highlight the owner's sense of responsibility. Denise described feeling obligation to Ivy to fulfill it by protecting her. This responsibility became Denise's reason to keep going, even to stay alive. Her commitment motivated her decision to live in her car rather than enter housing without Ivy. In turn, she described Ivy as providing the daily, steady affection that kept her going. For both Tommy and Denise, the fulfillment of the obligation associated with commitment to an animal requires a sacrifice.
All right.
Giving up drugs or alcohol or deciding to live in the car. The perceived love the animal provides and the accompanying sense that one matters rewards the sacrifice. By being worthy of the animal's love, the owner casts him or herself as a good person. Before I conclude, I want to make very clear that I don't think an animal's love solves any of the material problems of life on the streets. And I'm not suggesting that pet ownership is a panacea for homelessness. Instead, I'm pointing out that the ways that homeless people talk about their relationships helps us understand how they deal with their situations. When I reflect on the relationships homeless people describe, the strength of the bond didn't surprise me at all. I didn't find it remarkable that homeless people love their animals. What did surprise me were the aspects of the relationships that I have never had to consider. And in closing, I'll offer these 3 lessons that I learned from homeless pet owners. First, I have never had to defend my right to have a companion animal or my ability to care for one, nor has anyone ever called me unworthy of an animal's companionship. Many of the domiciled think it's wrong to have a companion animal if you don't have a home, as I once did. Most of the homeless people I talked to had heard this criticism regularly. When I asked how they responded, most pointed out that they did care for their animals and that having a house doesn't guarantee that a person will provide a dog or a cat with a good life. Instead, they redefined a good life for an animal in terms of constant companionship. One man captured this well when he told me, "I just tell them my dog is with me 24/7. He gets to be out in the sunshine and fresh air. He gets plenty of exercise. Where's your dog? Home alone in a crate?" Second, and related to this about having your dog with you 24/7, those of us who are domiciled don't have to move around the constant presence of our animals. Sure, we can leave them alone for a few hours or put them in doggy daycare while we go about our day, but homeless people can't even use a public restroom without considering their animals. Because friendships on the streets can be very short-lived and questionable, they can't always count on others to watch their dogs. One woman learned that a so-called friend who agreed to mind her dog for a few hours had simply turned him loose when she got bored. "I was down at animal control every day," she told me. "I was scared to death. Fortunately, the dog turned up." Some homeless people have resolved the 24/7 problem by obtaining documentation for emotional support animals. And technically this applies only to housing and transportation sometimes, but the confusion around what constitutes a service animal has left a lot of wiggle room and uncertainty. Third, most of us who are domiciled don't have to worry about it, that our animals will be taken from us or killed. Homeless people often face the fear that police or animal control officers will confiscate their animals. Several people had police officers pull guns on the dogs they had left to temporarily guard their gear and their campsites. 2 people I talked to had their dogs killed by police officers who assumed they were vicious. A few people who had gone to jail for minor offenses learned on release that their dogs had been killed in shelters. Denise constantly feared that a well-meaning stranger like me would see a cat locked in a car, assume animal cruelty, call animal control. The cat would be confiscated and she would lose the only family she had. So many people I talked to had kept their dogs and cats vigilantly vaccinated and microchipped, so if anything happened, they couldn't be separated from them. When we consider what animals mean for the homeless, it's easy to focus on the strength of the bond, and it's not wrong to do so. As the 3 lessons I learned show, however, the human-animal relationship also poses unique challenges for those on the street. These experiences too, and not just the love and support, are part of their everyday lives. The way they cope with them reveals the commitment homeless people make with their animals. So thanks. I'd love to chat, have questions, whatever else is in store.
Yeah, wow. You gave us a lot to think about. I'm looking at some of the chats and this idea of having to defend your right to have companion animals in your lives. I mean, that's not something many of us on this thread can relate to. I also see some commentary. Well, I have my own personal commentary, just that idea that your animal could end up in a shelter. And, you know, there are still kill shelters in our country, and that reality that's beyond you can't change that, right? That is an inevitability. So, you know, the chat box is open. Please ask your questions. I do have a couple to ask our intern, Carly. She says that it's been close to a decade since your groundbreaking ethnographic work on people with companion animals experiencing homelessness. What do you think has changed? And what do you think are the hurdles most necessary to overcome?
How time flies. I think there is definitely, well, this conference is evidence of probably the most major change, right? That there is a real awareness of the need for co-sheltering and their efforts to do that. There's also an increase in veterinary clinics for the pets of the homeless. When I did the research, which is, took place even before the book came out, there were only a few that consistently took place across the country. And now there are many, many more. The fabulous Street Dog Coalition, they out of Fort Collins, Colorado, they will run a veterinary clinic anywhere in the country. Just after a phone call or an email, John Geller and his crew will be on it. But so those are the two main things. And I know you had to talk about pet care as a social justice issue yesterday. And I really think that some of these pop-up clinics are responding to that need. So those are the two areas, but I do think, there is a lot more to be done. And there's a lot more to be done in terms of awareness too. Although it's been a decade, I still talk to people all the time who were like I used to be. If you live on the street, you can't take care of an animal. Well, let's talk about what's going on with your dog right now.
Yeah, I have to say, I think like a lot of people in this commentary in the chat box, I had my own preconceived notions, right? I didn't think if you could take care of yourself, you can't take care of an animal. And that exhibition, My Dog is My Home, really just shattered that. And it took me getting to know the voices and people and families we featured that's everything. It can be a game changer in their lives. And so I think storytelling, and we're focusing a lot on storytelling within this conference, is critical, right? Creating those conversations and putting the spotlight on the subject matter is really important.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I don't see a lot of questions coming through the chat. Please ask your questions. We have probably another 15 minutes or so, a little less, for Q&A. I do have another one. It seems clear, this is also from Carly, it seems clear from your research that people are very devoted to their animals and their animals make their lives better. Could we say the same thing about animals? In your research, did you observe any of that?
Is it better for, is the animal's welfare okay, is basically the question.
Yeah, and then are their lives better because they have a human in it? Just kind of putting this on its head.
I think in many cases the answer is yes. I went into the Homeless Youth Alliance on Haight Street in San Francisco with a veterinarian on the day of a street clinic. And in the living room, there were homeless youth with 15, 20 dogs. They were all calm. They were sitting there. There was no fighting, no panting, no barking. I had never seen anything like it. Now, if I guarantee you right now, if I take my dog to the veterinarian's office down the street, well, with curbside, we can't do that at the moment, but thinking back, you walk into the veterinarian's office there and the dogs are anxious, the dogs are barking, the dogs are just going nuts. And that really struck me. These dogs are incredibly well socialized. Certainly there are exceptions, but just being around people and other dogs all the time, I think is really, dogs seem to love it. Now I know it's very hard on cats. Most of the people I talked to who had cats lived in settled places, junkyards, school buses, things like that. If you're traveling with a cat, that's a pretty tough life, I think.
Yeah, they're not all as socialized as James Bowen's Bob. Apparently he just loves high-fiving all these strangers and going to Tokyo. And yeah, he was a very well-traveled cat. All right, we have a question from Christine. Do you see many differences in themes across different types of homeless populations? For example, people experiencing homelessness because of natural disasters, domestic violence, homeless youth, etc.
Good question. I didn't study people who were homeless because of natural disasters. Actually, I had done disaster research before this book. I have a book called Filling the Ark, which is about animal welfare and disasters. And some of my resistance to doing this book on homelessness was that, gee, I just did a book on animals and disasters. I want to do something really cheerful, you know? So I can't answer that question, but the distinction I would draw is time on the street or time being homeless. And I think people who are newly homeless and who see their condition, their circumstances as temporary and resolvable, probably tell very different kinds of stories than people who are chronically homeless or people who have really embraced the identity of being a street person. And their stories about their dogs and their lives are very different, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. In my moderation, I was moderating a session yesterday, and the landscape that we find ourselves in, the number of natural disasters, right? We see climate change happening, and this is going to be progressively worse, right? We are going to be finding these instances of homelessness in a lot of different ways. I think about the pending eviction crisis, and it's there is a huge demand for us to pay attention. We
Yes.
have a veterinarian who's chimed in, and he would love to think about ways in which we can increase awareness to practicing vets and veterinary students at the school level. Any thoughts on that?
Increase awareness about homeless pet ownership among veterinary students?
I think so, or maybe how they can be a part of this puzzle.
Oh, well, UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine has been running for a couple of decades their veterinary clinic, their student-run veterinary clinic at the Loaves and Fishes in Sacramento. And Loaves and Fishes is amazing. They have a kennel boarding, quote unquote, facility where homeless people are responsible for caring for their dogs, but it's a place they can leave their dog for a few hours if they need to look for a job, apply for benefits, whatever. But the Mercer Street Clinic, it's called, and I think that would be a terrific model for any School of Veterinary Medicine if it wanted to get started at the club level. And finding ways for interested students to assist with some of these pop-up clinics that the Street Coalition runs or that originate from other veterinary sources, I think would be great opportunity.
Yeah, no, agreed. Here's another question. For those who are bonded to their animals and the animal's welfare is not being taken care of, how is it best to handle that case without causing harm to the human's ability to trust and use resources in the future?
Well, I would love to answer that with a veterinarian and also with maybe a mental health professional. And one of the great things that Street Dog Coalition is doing that Vet SOS in San Francisco also does is they take out with them a physician or a physician's assistant or someone who's a mental health provider. And they might not do anything all during the clinic, but they're there. So if someone, let's say they see a dog whose welfare is not good, certainly if there's indications of abuse, the mental health professional could be consulted. Or if it seems like it's a matter of not being able to feed the dog, that's something that can fairly easily be remedied. But I think there are bound to, just as there are with people who are domiciled, for example, anyone who works in sheltering knows that there are many instances of neglect that occur among pet owners who have very nice houses. And so that challenge of how do you get them to take better care of their animals when they think they're perfectly capable of doing it? Something I don't have an easy answer to.
Maybe another book is in order. Well, and we have a lot of questions of people asking where they can order your book, but am I wrong in recollecting that it's out of print now? That's like a collector's item.
No, it's not.
No, it is? Oh, okay.
It's out in paperback. It's a little glary now, I know, but here it is.
I have the hardcover edition.
Yes, it's definitely not out of print. I'm still raking in the box from it. Any bookstore can order it, but you can also get it from Jeff Bezos and his crew on Amazon.
Ah, all right.
Yep. Just type in my last name and my books will come up.
Cool. Christine has one more question following up on that conversation about natural disasters. Is there anything, and then we have to kind of wrap up and jump into breakout groups. Is there anything for us as a group of professionals and advocates in homelessness and co-sheltering to take away from all the progress that's been made in co-sheltering people and animals due to natural disasters?
Another great question, Christine. I think to continue to recognize the interconnectedness of pet ownership with all the issues around homelessness, that it's not that this person has this set of issues that have to do with income, maybe substance abuse, maybe housing, maybe this other thing, mental health, so on. Oh, and then they have a dog. That the pet ownership has to be addressed as part of that. And I know that's a tough call because that's not always going on for people who are housed. But I think the work that this organization is doing is terrific. And mainly I would say keep up the good work, but just continue to recognize the role that pets play in people's lives is connected to just about every other aspect of their life.